So welcome everyone to the fourth CCT event of this semester. The series as such for this semester is titled Beyond the Metropolis. So far we have had three participants and speakers, a filmmaker, Renu Sawant, urbanist Naveen Mahantesh from Bangalore, and Pratyush Shankar, who presented his work a couple of weeks ago. And today we have Praveen Bavadekar with us from Belgaum. Before I hand over the screen to Praveen, what I would like to do is just quickly read out the outline for this series, so that we kind of get a framework for this session and all the sessions that will follow. So the series is titled Beyond the Metropolis, and the sort of outline that we sketched for this goes this way. Urban conditions beyond metropolises in India have been widely viewed as inward-looking enclaves of local economy, culture, and politics. Urban life is considered to unfold here in the shadow of the globally connected and much sought-after world-class metro cities through illegible property rights, social interactions, enmeshed in primordial communal passions, the architecture of an urban form that lends towards social segregation, and so on. As emerging contexts fuel the explosion of such urban conditions, India's urban turn has decisively poised towards the proliferation of small cities during the last decade. This series of C conversations invites artists, architects, filmmakers, and urbanists to offer provocations on how we could read into and engage the multiple emerging presence and futures of urban life, urban form, and architecture beyond the metropolitan conditions. To speak briefly about Praveen Bavadekar, Praveen studied architecture at BMS College in Bangalore and at the AA London. He is a principal of Thirdspace Architecture Studio, a practice based out of Belgaum, a small city sited in the cusp of three cultures and two geographies. He is also a founding director of the Formist Group, a real estate development company based in Bangalore. Praveen works on a range of projects across typologies and scales in the region from Mumbai to Bangalore. His talk is titled The Granularity of Our Urban Hinterland, a delve into how urbanity pervades through the Indian landscape beyond its big cities, where homogenizing forces of commerce and a seeping consumer culture contest with deeply rooted and sometimes historical structures of power and community. Through the lens of a few of our projects, which is Praveen's projects, in three medium-sized cities, a few hundred kilometers from one another, an effort is made to see how cities come to define their urban identity. So with that, I would invite Praveen to give his presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shreyank, and thank you, C, for giving me this opportunity. So, and hi everybody, whoever is tuned in. So I'll start with the presentation now, and as the title says, it's like what we did is we distilled our work over the past so many years into three cities and three projects for each of these cities, and through which what we want to get, what we want to kind of explore is how our projects have developed, but also how these projects are themselves a result of forces of urbanization, which have gone on for the last 400-500 years. And yeah, so I mean, so we did some basic studies into we've always been interested into this urbanity, which kind of pervades all throughout India. And as the kind of the Beyond the Metropolis brief itself kind of points out, there is this, how could you say, a binary opposite which is kind of created, a perceptible kind of a contrast between the metropolises, the 6 or 7 or 8 such cities which are like really big in scale in India, and then the rest of the urban landscape, so to speak. So India is about, I think we have about 34% or something which is urbanized, and the rest are living in the villages, the 6 lakh or so or 7 lakh villages. So we did this this study of like how these cities are then distributed geographically, and then most of these bigger cities which you see, has some kind of an association with colonization also, because whether it's Delhi, whether it's Mumbai, Chennai, or Kolkata, these all have come from a kind of a colonial past also. So that gives you a kind of a, so we were actually graphically trying to even see how this landscape actually unfolds when you see it visually. So yeah, and then so what happens is, like, then you have, of course, Mumbai at the very highest in terms of population, and then quickly it kind of peters out, and then you have this large landscape which is like quite kind of consisting of cities maybe which are like 4 lakh, maybe 2 lakh, 200,000 people, or even 100,000 people. So we made the study of like how this this kind of graph goes with the population in India. And then if you see on the right, you do see that a large number of the urban population is not residing in the first 7 or 8 cities, but rather in these other cities which somehow escaped, like the critical thinking in our profession. So yeah, I mean, that's how, even for example, if GDP is any indicator of growth, or it's any indicator of how a kind of a country is growing, or how a country, like how productive a kind of a region is, then you see a kind of a landscape which of course is dominated by Maharashtra, but not so much. You still have other parts of the country which are kind of evenly kind of contributing to the GDP of the country. And so is the, like, another index which we kind of thought would be interesting to see is then the cement consumption across India, and how that is reflective of how development is happening. Or like, of course, cement can be used in various ways. It could go towards infrastructure, it could go towards factories, but largely as the consumption of cement is also kind of a indicator of how a country is urbanizing and which parts are urbanizing. So these studies, or these kind of exercises, we were kind of trying to do in order to imagine the kind of we generally kind of look at a kind of a homogeneous landscape, which is India, and like we very much can define, or we can identify with it in terms of its iconic value of what the Indian map is. But then if you start if you start granulating it, or if you start looking at it through other data, you start revealing other landscapes other than what we think of, like there's just other than, say, the geographical nature of India. You start looking at the developmental nature of India, or how, say, different kinds of industries are kind of diffused through this country, or how cities are diffused through this country. And we also looked at, like, our own profession, as to how does our profession kind of permeate through this subcontinent. And what you then find, of course, is that there are certain regions in the country which have much lesser architects than other regions. But then there's one state, and I've kept Maharashtra blank here, because it just dominates and eclipses the rest of the country. I mean, you can barely see what's happening behind if I just keep this on in the map. So maximum number of architects in India tend to be in Maharashtra. So like Maharashtra is a kind of a huge kind of a sinkhole for architects also. And we looked at, say, architecture colleges and architecture seats throughout the country. And here also you see that Maharashtra and especially Mumbai, Pune, they start dominating. Then you have Bangalore, you have Chennai, you have Delhi, and we have taken the greater Delhi region, including Gurgaon, etc. And then you have all these small kind of architecture schools everywhere. But then you see the dominance of these specific kind of urban agglomerations, which are like a few, maybe 8 or 10, which are actually dominating the whole architectural landscape of the country. And that's what we wanted to get at. Like this is the number of practicing architects in tier 1 cities and then in other cities. So what's actually what we get at here is a kind of like a kind of a whole landscape, wherein there's a lot of urbanization which is happening in the towns. A lot of building activities happening. A lot of people are kind of building homes. Maybe they're kind of there are kind of demands for housing. There's demands for industries, or even for commerce. But then most of the focus has been on this 8, 10, or 15 or 20 cities which are there in India. And then there's a kind of a huge gap in what the rest of the India is building and how it is engaging with the profession of architecture, even with urbanists. And that's what we wanted to kind of look at. And we are kind of a practice. We have been, who has been working in this landscape. And this landscape is a kind of a varied landscape. So I couldn't say that like, if we are working in this kind of a particular region, the same kind of experiments could be kind of followed in some other region or something, because this landscape itself is a very diverse landscape. And that's what we wanted to get in this presentation. So one of the things which we looked at is how then we could look at our own landscape, and through the lens of that, we could kind of explore some of these urbanizing factors which are happening. So here we are, like Belgaum is where we are situated. And this is the road towards Pune. And then the same road, like this road on this side, it heads towards Bangalore. So this is the Pune-Bangalore highway on which Belgaum is located. And then you have Kolhapur, which is in Maharashtra. And it's at about a distance of about 100 kilometers to the north. And to the south, at about 100 kilometers, you have Hubli. And we have taken these three cities as like sites at which we have not only actually dealt with projects extensively, but also today as sites where some kind of a resolution can happen about how these cities are growing and how different they are from one another. So this is a place called Hubli, which is between Kolhapur and Belgaum. So what you see in the center is a kind of a fountain. This is a very small kind of a town now. Maybe the population maybe about 50,000 or something. And you see on the left a mausoleum to one of the rulers who used to be here. And you see this entire town used to be irrigated with this underground plumbing, with these fountains at every squares, etc. And then most of it has vanished now. So this Hubli used to be at one time, maybe in the 14th or 15th century, maybe it was as powerful as say a Belgaum or a Kolhapur or something. But then slowly in time, it lost its importance. And it's now a kind of a part of the Belgaum district. So this is how cities or maybe urban agglomerations unfold. Like over time, certain places go on to become bigger cities, certain places kind of go into irrelevance. And this is something which I found very interesting. This was on one of my trips, one of my kind of site visits or something to one of these villages out here. I just happened to see the structures, and then I went around exploring this town. And the more I explored, I saw these really nice urban kind of spaces which are created for this town, but which for the last 200-300 years were just like neglected. And that also makes it like interesting as to like how then a place like Belgaum or a place like Kolhapur goes on to become a kind of a bigger town or a kind of a bustling kind of an economy, and some of these kind of just get waylaid on the side. So yeah, I mean, I just earlier I was talking about this to Shreyank and Prasad. Like I was reading this book very recently. It's a kind of a very it just got released maybe 10-15 days back. It's about Lords of the Deccan, wherein it's about the dynasties which flourished in these areas, in the Deccan areas, from say Chalukyas to Rashtrakutas, Hoysalas, Cholas, etc. And so one kind of a particular paragraph struck me about when he says about the Kailasa temple in Ellora. He points out that like after all these kind of politics and betrayals and everything, the complexity of their lives just kind of goes off. Like these emperors who were kind of trying for all kinds of ways in which they could become immortal, but somehow it kind of gets lost in time. But what remains is some kind of architect having created a Kailasa temple or something, that structure stays on. So that was something which kind of stayed with me. One is how these kind of regions have had so much of complexity, like each of these kind of like something like a Chalukya or something, an empire which was there for about 400 years, is maybe 5 times in terms of a kind of a timeline than what our present Republic of India is. But then even that got kind of waylaid, and the towns of those times also kind of somewhere they got kind of lost, and some of them became irrelevant, some of them became kind of industrial towns now, and then this whole cycle kind of keeps going on. So what interested me also is looking at our own projects and trying to see like how these projects have come from a kind of a particular past and how we can position them in this past. So we start with the first city, like I'll go from north to south. So I'll start with Kolhapur. And so Kolhapur, of course, I mean, it has its antecedents in the past, and it had this dynasty called Silaharas, and they have built this amazing temple, which you see on the left-hand side, which is the Kopeshwar temple. And then the Panhala fort is something which goes back to, again, the 11th century or something. And then it was, of course, Panhala later became a kind of a Maratha stronghold. So it has this kind of a, like different, in different centuries and different times, different power structures have kind of emerged here. Like sometimes it was a part of the Adil Shahi Empire, sometimes the Mughal Empire, sometimes the Marathas, of course, and then later, of course, it was a princely state till it seceded to the Indian Union. And so one of the things which stays on, like there are certain things which stay on from this past, for example, from even the past of like the Silaharas, is this Lakshmi temple. And Kolhapur became a kind of a big economy, not only because of the agricultural produce which was around it and that it became a center of commerce, but also because of the temple economy. And when we were kind of doing this particular project, and so you see this kind of a continuity from even the 11th or 8th century till here, through this kind of a, when we try to analyze Kolhapur for a kind of a commercial project, we looked at Kolhapur and we looked at the commercial clusters and how they have developed in the city. And the temple economy, the economy which is around the Mahalakshmi temple, still has, has precedence over all other forms of economy in this city. Like it still kind of commands, in terms of the economy. Then, of course, we have our site over here. So we were kind of locating it within a kind of a commercial landscape. And we had this kind of an ancient temple from, like 1,000 years back. And then the markets which kind of got formed around it. And then we identified another economy, which was the transit economy, because Kolhapur also, with its train station and the bus stands, etc., it kind of has its own economy around that of people who are coming from the outside, and then they are spending their time there either for business or for going to the temple, etc. So these were the kind of and then a kind of a third economy which is there is the high street economy. What we kind of like classified it as the high street economy is something which came up in maybe the early 90s or something with liberalization. You had like shops coming in, and like you had various brands, like first of all clothing brands, shoes, etc., which kind of started then coming, and they could not have gone to the inner city, which was quite cluttered, and say they came into these suburbs which are formed in the 70s, etc. And so we looked at how, for example, this particular landscape is when we look at how people prefer to buy houses here, like where do they prefer to buy houses, where are the rates higher and all that. So this data, of course, was this kind of research was done by us when we were still in the lockdown. And so most of the research was not, so we looked at very innovative sources in which we could kind of look at this stuff. Like, for example, we looked at magic bricks, and we looked at of course, the sensors, etc., which are the most obvious. But we also looked at magic bricks. We looked at, say, Zomato. We took ratings from Zomato, etc., in order to kind of declutter and see this this kind of a place for what it was, like the context of a site. So yeah, and so there are these kind of like I'm talking about one particular site here, which was a kind of a small triangular piece of land, which is at a very important junction in the city, which is it's called the Kaula Naka or something. And there's a kind of statue, an equestrian statue of Tarabai on this spot. And so we had this 1 acre of land wherein we were kind of asked to imagine a commercial building. And also that 1 acre site had this building there, which is a protected structure. So it has, this building has its own significance in the history of Kolhapur. So one of the kind of, how could you say, like one of the requirements of the brief was that we had to somehow retain this building or then look at relocating it, or if we could not retain it because it occupies the center of the site. And yeah, I mean, this is the site, and this is the kind of the area which was around it. And it's largely residential with some amounts of commercial activity happening. The main commercial activity, of course, happens towards the temple and towards the bus stands, etc. So we looked at, but then this is also an area which is around some of the how could you say, the posher neighborhoods of the town. And that's why this was also the area which had a lot of restaurants and some of the malls which are coming up. So this was a kind of a speculative urbanism, so to speak, but it plugged into what was happening with the city. You know, the kind of restaurants which are coming up, the malls which are coming around, because this area seemed to have a lot more space than some of the inner city. And that's why the city also was growing towards this. And then we looked at various things, like we were also trying to, like, one of the ideas also was that how do we come up with a program for this? So we looked at single screens theaters around India, and like where does Kolhapur come in, and like whether we could have theaters here or we could not. The kind of 24-hour timelines of various programs which we could propose, and for that we looked at we were trying to even do a kind of a data-driven analysis, but then that data sometimes had to be something which we could do on an armchair or something, because we could not travel to Kolhapur because of the lockdown. So then it was taken from maybe popular times of like how Google would kind of rate a particular kind of a, say, Gold's Gym or something, or a Asian Jacks or something, and like what are the popular times, when does it open, when does it close, those kinds of stuff. And yeah, and then with that we came up with this the kind of people whom we would be catering to, and the kind of activities which could happen here. And yeah, of course, especially in Kolhapur, more than in Belgaum or something, Kolhapur being near Pune and being a part of, and as we have seen from the earlier maps also, Maharashtra is highly urban, and it's also, it has a kind of a history of urbanity, like starting from even Mumbai or even before Pune, etc., etc. So the laws are highly evolved compared to, say, a place like Belgaum, where it can be a little like a Wild West or something sometimes when it comes to creatively looking at bylaws. So at the time when we were doing this project was also the time when there was a kind of a unified bylaws which were introduced in Maharashtra. So it was quite interesting to then kind of look at that and see how that kind of impacted our site. And so we made these various studies of how we could use up the FAR of the building, or we could kind of generate FAR for the building rather. And at two scenarios, like one is with the heritage building and one is without the heritage building. And so with this, we came up with certain iterations. So we were kind of coming up with iterations, and then we were going back to the clients, and then we were taking feedback from them. Sometimes the feedback was about like how the heritage building had to be treated, etc., etc. So this was one of the first iterations which we did, in which we looked at various forms in how this building could come about. So one of the things which we were kind of interested in looking at is with these small towns, there's not much of a service economy which is there. You know, like small towns are largely like when it comes to Kolhapur or Belgaum or Hubli, these are economies which are driven largely by, say, agricultural produce. They're driven by kind of factories, and they are driven by small businesses, etc. So what happens is the ground floors and the first floors are very easy to populate in such cases. But as you move up the building, then you don't have that many offices or something which can occupy those floors. So what happens is we need to kind of capitalize on the ground floor, but then we also need to creatively think of what will happen to these upper floors, especially if you're thinking of a building which is going about 12 or 15 feet, 15 floors high or something like that. So one of the things which we're exploring at that time, and then this comes up later in our later iterations, is we were thinking whether we could take a ramp all around the building, and we could we could create this whole kind of a wrap around and let cars go all the way up. And so let the kind of the street economy just climb up the building. So that was one of our kind of ways of looking at how we could colonize this space and colonize and take care of the FAR also. So these are some kind of variations on that, what we were trying out. So finally, we came up with a much kind of a tamer version in the first iteration, which is more about how the building responds to the street at the lower level, and as it climbs up, it starts responding to the junction, the very important traffic junction which was there. So that was a kind of a form which we kind of came up with. So in this first iteration, of course, we were kind of thinking of taking the heritage building entirely out of the site, because the heritage building per se didn't have any value when it comes to the building as such, but it was just that there's certain important things which had happened in the history of Kolhapur, and they were associated with that site, and that's why that building had listed. So we were thinking of like completely kind of doing away with that, and that's when we kind of looked at this proposal. And this, of course, was a very quick kind of 3Ds which we had done in order to get our clients to kind of understand how this building would then sit in this space. So one of the other things was, as a brief from the client, like looking at this area also happens to be at a sufficient elevation from the rest of Kolhapur. So any building here which is about ground plus 15 or something would kind of have a kind of a towering presence over the landscape, and that's what they wanted to kind of ensure. So this, we thought, was one way of doing it. And then, of course, like one of the feedbacks was that we should kind of first try for a kind of options with the heritage building, or at least accommodating the heritage building. So that's the building over there. And then we also had to have 10% of it had to be a recreational area. So that was that. And then we kind of thought of a building which went around it, and then still had some shades of the earlier kind of a proposal. And this was that. So what I want to just get across through this is also the not only the iterations, but the kind of even in these small towns, the kind of complexity which is involved in order to get projects done, or sometimes the kind of the multiple forces which are at play, and which needs you to be constantly resilient also. So this was one of the clients' suggestions, that why don't we move this building over at the back, and then so that we'll just keep it back and we'll just recreate it the way it was, and we'll just carefully kind of take it down, put it there, and maybe refurbish it. And then that's where this proposal came from. And then this was just kind of a quick way of kind of telling them, like, this is how then we could look at the FAR, and we could look at, like parcels of 3 floors each with podiums at various levels. Yeah, and this was again keeping it in the same place, but then we had like this whole thing of like at least having 300. They wanted about 300 cars to be parked. So this was one with a mechanical parking kind of a thing, but this is not one of my favorite kind of responses. But then with the heritage building at the bottom and this whole building kind of cascading down. And this is where we are at with this particular proposal, and where we have kind of done some amount of study, which we think may be a more viable kind of a way to go forward, is like moving the heritage building to this corner over here. One of the ideas of the earlier proposal was to have mechanical parking, but then mechanical parking was something which was frowned upon by the clients, because they felt that the whole aspect of like people waiting for their cars, or like waiting to have their cars kind of given to the valets or something, is not something which was conducive with Kolhapur. So we kind of took that on board, and we tried to think of a proposal which took some of our earlier ideas of like letting cars go up the building, and letting actually the parking move in tandem with our commercial floors, so that even our upper floors become viable. So in this, the recreational area, the mandatory 10% open space or something, it comes to this corner over here. So it activates that corner as well as that building. And then we have a basement, and we have these kind of ramps which are going up, but then at every half a floor, you have some amount of parking. So the ramps get integrated with the parking itself. And then slowly, I think this whole thing starts climbing up in half floors, rather than in kind of an entire kind of a floor of 3.75 meters or something. So then what you get is, oh, I think I've lost some of those things, I think. Wait a minute. Yeah, that's fine. But then building moves up, wherein you get a kind of a parking area, which is at the rear, and this building in the front, which is responding to various kind of zoning laws also, wherein it also starts receding every 1 meter, 1 meter for every 1 floor. And this is the equestrian statue in the foreground, and this is the building, the way it relates to with the heritage building. And then this is a kind of a plaza which gets created over here. And this, what you see on the right hand side, is actually the parking structure, which stops after the which floor is this? Which is, I think, 8th or 9th floor it stops, and then after that the building just carries on further. So within this we accommodate the whole parking which is required. And this is the parking structure which you see on the left hand side. And this is the way the parking structure also gets integrated with the building. So one of the interesting things which we are trying out with this, of course, this is the museum cafe. We have proposed a cafe, and this building could be kind of fashioned as a museum and a cafe, which responds to that Tarabai circle over there. So we also imagined a kind of a light, kind of a skin for the parking area, which is a kind of a breathing skin. It's a kind of a mesh with a LED screen integrated with it. And generally kind of commercial spaces happening on the ground first, and even up to the 4th floor. So one of the ways in which we're trying to get the street up, because that was one of our ideas in this proposal, is to first of all take these office areas and divide them in kind of multiple levels. So at every half a level you get a kind of office area, and then we had a very simple kind of a circulation, like with simple kind of a zoning with the circulation kept in the center, and then you just had this lifts over here, some toilets over here, and a staircase over here, another staircase which comes over here, and then the parking over here, which moves in half levels. So what we also did is we infused two things with the parking, like two extra kind of functions, which generally the builders are not asked us for. One is we introduced the shops over here in the center, which also allowed the cars to have a kind of a turning radius over here. But it also gave us a shop at every half a level, which we thought would be kind of food kiosks, or it could be florists, or even newspaper stands, etc., which would actually make people use this space for other purposes than, say, just parking there. And we also had another 1.5 meters, which was left here, for which we could have kind of projected out, which we didn't need for parking. And what we proposed there was a kind of a continuous kind of a garden. But this garden, what we thought is, instead of it being something which the developer has to maintain, it could actually become a nursery, wherein he could rent it out to a nursery, or to kind of a urban farmers or something like that, and actually kind of grow maybe saplings, or even plants or trees, etc., and which could then be sold, as a kind of a commercial activity. So our idea was also to kind of how these functions, could actually, we could look at these functions as things which not only enrich the lives of people who are inside and who are using these office spaces or commercial spaces, but also become a part of the city. So we had this thing that we could maybe, this place could start having maybe a coffee shop or something, or a kind of a ice cream parlor, which would become popular in the neighborhood or in the city, and it could be used independently of the building also. People would actually go up to the third level or something like that and start using these spaces. So that was one of our ideas behind this, or strategies behind activating this building also. And yeah, so our kind of goal also was then how to make these monofunctional areas of parking and kind of infuse them with programs, so that like in the night or something, when you don't need so much parking, when offices are closed, then how could then these parkings then become places which are infused with urban life. And yeah, so we had this whole kind of a section, for example, which was happening here, which was basically a kind of a service area and a servant space, if you could call it that. And then this becomes a kind of an urban space, say after 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the night, and maybe goes on till about 11 or 12. So that was also our idea behind introducing these other programs in these spaces. So yeah, that's about that. Like that project is at that level, and we are now putting it to the Heritage Committee, etc., for further discussions, and maybe it will go in that direction and some other direction. And the second project which we would like to kind of talk about in Kolhapur is this very kind of a mundane, so to speak, project of redevelopment, wherein you just take a site, like very speculative, and when, because of all these new zoning laws, etc., like builders are kind of increasingly looking at all these old apartments which are built about 30 years back, and then they are giving them some space, and then they are creating new apartments and new living spaces. But in this also, like one of the constraints was that then you are like the brief is given to you as to how much extra you can give and how much your kind of area of a flat can be. We cannot go beyond those whatever limits have been defined for us. And so then we were kind of grappling with this idea of like, how could we then look at maximizing spaces for maximizing the livability of these spaces. And what we looked at is then at the fringe, And generally it's about 600 or something is allowed as a kind of a kind of an elevational kind of a or an architectural kind of feature for these buildings, even after your whatever setback and after your balcony projection. And we looked at how then this fringe can actually become a kind of a functional space wherein the 600 then folds and unfolds and kind of maybe tweaks itself to become maybe sitting spaces or like table surfaces, etc. And then that itself becomes the elevation. And our manipulation of this these surfaces itself starts getting us a kind of a form. And that's that entirely starts defining how people start living in the spaces also, because then the exteriors become very active and they become places wherein they are multiply coded and where people could be kind of doing many other things than what they could be doing inside the flats, because the flats then tend to have very strong coding of like, this is the bedroom, this is the living room or kitchen, etc. So this is again a kind of a what we are finding in Kolhapur in all these projects is how then do we manipulate, not manipulate in a bad way, but rather how do we kind of look at the zoning laws? How do we kind of look at how could you say, like openings in them in which you could then intervene. So whereas the earlier project or even this project, we are looking at the zoning laws very with maybe a lens or something in order to see like what is it that we could kind of take out from that and how it could kind of then transform the lives of the people who are using it. And in a very different so these are, of course, these are some of the spaces then which are created, because the balconies also, which we are kind of forced to give because of the site constraints, etc., were like hardly a meter or 0.9 meters. So this actually, if we had taken it at the floor level, then it counts as counts in the FSI. But if you take it at an upper level, then it doesn't. And then on another scale, in another apartment in Kolhapur, we looked at a very different kind of an approach, wherein this is for a slightly different clientele, wherein we had to design these apartments for, say, 4-bedroom apartments for a slightly more affluent class maybe, and wherein you had just 2 flats per floor, and you had a kind of a 15-floor building. So again, there are various ways in which we are looking at using the zoning book and seeing what opens up there, that which could be a kind of a differentiator for the way people live in these buildings. And so as a kind of a maybe a marketing spiel, but also like something which is aspirational in the small towns is this idea of a house, because the flat is always considered as a compromise to the house. The house is always the kind of the aspirational idea of how you would like to live. And then even with houses, it's when generally people come to us with even say any brief for a house or something, whenever they want to build a house, they kind of tend to kind of gravitate towards some of these colonial ideas of what houses were. Like you had this veranda, which was like this in-between space, and this kind of a multiply coded space outside, and then you had this garden, and then you had this house inside which had all these private spaces. So we were looking at and like, of course, the multiple coding of such spaces which are part circulation and part living spaces. So when we were looking at this kind of a site, we looked at the flats being on 2 sides and then a kind of a circulation core in the middle. But we also had a lot of FAR which was left, which was, how could you say, it's called ancillary FSI or something like that. So which could be kind of used for corridors and circulation, staircases, etc., etc. Since we had so much of that left, we thought of putting it here and creating these verandas. And then again, coding this whole thing as a kind of a veranda, which is all around, which is a kind of a semi-public area. But in practice, it actually becomes the private space of an individual apartment. So what you get is a kind of the circulation core, the flats on both sides, and then we start getting these kind of verandas here, which are then converted even to gardens, and a part of them are also converted as these balconies. And so here we are looked at various things. One is the flats are on both sides, and then these are the veranda spaces and garden spaces which are coming on the eastern side. And the western side, of course, has the circulation core. And we are also looking at how you can redefine windows in this particular project, wherein generally a window has 3 different uses, which are one is for light, of course, one is for ventilation, and one is for the vision outside. And we thought we could have these windows which had like specific functions. For example, we could introduce a kind of a secondary skin over here. So that was also something which the codes allowed us, like this kind of an architectural projection by which we could have a second skin here and a sliding window inside. And then we could have a fixed glass over here which would let in light, and ventilation could be entirely through the second skin, which also becomes spaces wherein you could have additional landscape elements, or you could also have your service elements, for example, AC, what do you call them? Whatever. So our AC outdoor units, all of these could kind of come up over here, plus even maybe humidifiers, etc., could be installed here so that you could modulate the climate, microclimate inside. So those were some of the things which we're trying out on this project. And of course, this the aspirational nature of such kind of projects means that like we are trying to kind of give them a kind of a lifestyle which is which they normally associate with apartment living in maybe bigger cities like Pune or something. So like they want spas, for example, and there's an entire recreational floor which comes on the 13th floor, and then the swimming pools and other flats which are overlooking those swimming pools, and lobbies. So these are all kind of carved in this kind of a space. And yeah, this is just some of the images of that. And we move on to the next city, and this of course is Belgaum. This is the city where our studio also is positioned and located. And so Belgaum actually is at a cusp of 3 very old routes. One is the route which went from Pune towards the south, Bangalore, etc. One which then branched out towards Goa and then towards Savanthwadi. So it's this kind of a junction where Belgaum kind of is located. And so it's of course, it started as a fort and a kind of a settlement somewhere in the 12th century AD, and with a moat and a kind of a lake around it. And then it grew on further. So this area is the old Belgaum, which is called the Shahapur. It is the name. It was the Shah, Asad Khan Shah, who had kind of started this area. And that's why the name is, as a respect to him. And then it grew on further to Vadgaon. And then it grew on again around the fort in a kind of an old settlement over here. And it's only when the British came that then you started having a cantonment. So Belgaum is one of these cities around the country which have a kind of a cantonment, fully functioning cantonment. And this cantonment is, if you see, was as big maybe as the Belgaum at that time. And of course, Belgaum has gone further a little bit, but this cantonment is still about 40% of what entire Belgaum is. And that, to a certain extent, defines how the city is, because cantonment is a kind of a place which is ossified in the past. It is something which still has a lot of development control rules, etc., which go back to the 19th century. And the railways, of course, were one of the kind of factors of growth, and that Those came up in the 1890s. And then you had something called the vaccine depot, where this site, which was completely out of the city, was selected. And that's where you had, at that time, the smallpox vaccine, etc., was had just been discovered, and they wanted an institute to be set up for that, for manufacture of that, and that was done here. Now this has become actually a void in this whole area, and that's actually a kind of a very contested kind of a space wherein the health department owns it, but then everyone else wants it, and then people want it to stay the way it is, etc. And then there was this place, this first suburb which came up, which was called the Tilakwadi. So this came up, and then after that, you had Hindawadi, which came up in the 1980s, and then you had other suburbs which came up in the 1990s. So that's how kind of Belgaum slowly grew. And then you had Hanuman Nagar in the 1990s, and then finally this is where we are at right now in 2022. So it is growing around this kind of roots over here, and then it is kind of expected to go some more in all these areas, but then the core still stays where it is. And so one of the things which we are looking at in Belgaum in these 3 projects is how Belgaum went from a kind of it's become more of a knowledge economy now, and from a kind of a largely agrarian kind of an economy. So the first project which I'll be showing you is a kind of a museum which we did for a 100-year-old institution, a kind of a society which has now about 250 kind of colleges around the country. And it all started with these 10 gentlemen who were largely from agrarian backgrounds, but who had also got, many of them had got educated and had become lawyers, etc. And these people decided to set up something called the KLE Society, Karnataka Lingayat Education Society, which started with one small college, and then it has grown into a behemoth now. But many of them came from kind of landed families around this area. And this, for example, is a palace which belonged to one of them. This is called the Chachidi Palace. So it is about 800 or 900 years old. And so these were kind of families which are kind of in some kind of a prominence or power through various changes, like right from Adil Shah's times to Marathas to British, etc. So these were kind of like families and maybe small principalities, etc., which existed, and they existed within all these forces of whatever changes are happening with whoever's ruling in distant Mumbai or wherever, Bijapur, etc. And then they kind of rightly kind of saw that like the future would be towards a kind of a knowledge-based economy, or rather, at least the community would develop further only if people got educated. And so they decided, like most of them were educated in places like Pune, and then they wanted to establish those kind of institutions here. And that's how they started with one kind of a small college in the fort area, and then later they moved to this campus. And so this was a kind of a museum which was supposed to commemorate 100 years of them starting this society. And so what we were given is this one of the first buildings which was built in the campus then, somewhere in the 1920s or something like that. It used to be a principal's quarters, and then since then it had gone into disrepair and was just kind of a like a storeroom or something. So we were given the idea, like this brief of transforming it into a museum which celebrated them. And initially the brief, of course, was just to kind of use this space and nothing else. And then what we kind of convinced the clients is to also use the area around it, and then make this as a part of the museum rather than the museum. So the landscape also became a part of the museum. So as a part of that, like this was a kind of a popular road, and then what you see here over here at the bottom is where your entrance is, and then you enter here, and then you come to this huge forecourt over here. And then we kind of traced a path, a linear path, wherein you would kind of go from the outside, then through some verandas, you would kind of enter the museum, and then go anti-clockwise, emerge out here, and then you could go out. So we created this whole kind of a processional path, which sometimes was inside, sometimes was in the landscape, sometimes was in kind of a semi-covered space. And so, yeah, these are some of the models wherein you can see this, like from the road, you kind of enter in here, and then you go through this pavilion, then you enter here, and then you come out, and then you go out here further, and then you can exit out. So you start at the entrance. It was just a simple kind of a door, a kind of a cotton steel door. You enter into this semi-open area, which also becomes a kind of a lobby for the museum. And then that's when you see the extent of the area around you. And these are the busts of the 10 people who were being commemorated as a part of this. So a brief history of them, and then how they contributed towards establishing this. So this is where you kind of then start your journey of discovering this society and its history. And then you come into the old lobby of that building over there. And then you come in, and then of course, there are certain architectural kind of interventions which we did. Like there are all these walls inside which we took down, and then there was this these walls at the center used to go right up to the top. So we got them down in order to open up the space when you look towards the top, and then we added a mezzanine on the top. And then so what actually happened is, like, we created this central armature wherein you had the staircase going up the mezzanine, a mezzanine introduced, and some structural elements which actually supported a kind of a nuclear story on the top. So it opened up what used to be a really kind of a small cramped space of a more domestic in nature, and created some kind of an institutional spatiality to this. Yeah, and then you from this kind of a main hall, you exit to this area over here, wherein there are various kind of like various functions to these spaces. Like this space was conceived as a place wherein we could kind of showcase the dignitaries who had kind of come to these institutions the last 100 years, and that was from Jawaharlal Nehru to many more people who had kind of visited these hallowed kind of premises. And then, of course, this was one of our kind of ideas of, like, we kind of added this kind of a hall of fame, wherein a lot of these people who have kind of since come out of these institutions have, like, whether they are doctors, whether they are scientists, like politicians, etc. They have all gone on to, many of them have gone on to become, achieve a lot in their lives. So they were kind of, we introduced this like a hall of fame wherein you could have a kind of a shield introduced for every person whom the society wishes to honor, any alumni or a teacher or something. So yeah, so this is actually like this in a way, when the entire like Belgaum used to consist of this kind of these kind of houses and this kind of architecture, and that's all kind of fast fading away. So this was one way in which we thought that we could also kind of at least preserve some part of the old Belgaum, but also like this the way the museum is located in the city and the way it has become a public space, it also kind of goes back and like talks about a past, which was not too distant. It was about 100 years back, wherein these people, like these 10 people, decided to make these changes, and they decided to kind of contribute in such a meaningful way in this area, which completely changed this area to a large extent. So it became more oriented towards education. It became a more kind of also an economy which is more right now exporting a lot of people outside, like whether it's software engineers or doctors. So what that also does is like one of their own institutions is in a small place, in a kind of a place over here, which is like an engineering college. So like they have one campus over here, which is like the law colleges, etc. They have one campus over here, another 100 acres. What you see as like these voids are actually their campuses. And this one over here, and then there's this one over here, which is the engineering college. And so what happens to the city is when these kind of colleges, etc., start coming, you also start having this scattered urbanism which is happening around them. For example, hostels, like small hostels start coming up. And this was one of our kind of much celebrated project, maybe from about 4 or 5 years back, wherein we were rather kind of trying to see how like we could maximize the space on a particular site. So as I told you earlier, like whereas Kolhapur is very it doesn't give you much to play with its bylaws, Belgaum does, or at least it did about 5 years back. And then we were actually thinking of how we could maximize the rent for the owner, because in order for that building to become viable. So we thought of this section for a kind of a hostel room, wherein it could we could have a kind of a small common area. We could have one kind of a semi-private area here for one hostelite, another one for another kind of occupant over here. And then there were two sections which we came up with, which dovetailed into one another. One had a kind of a common area which was at the bottom, and one had it in the kind of the center. And so when you kind of layered them in section, what you got is this kind of a section. And we had to keep to a height of 15 meters, after which the fire norms kick in. So we diligently kind of looked at that, and we came up with this section of a building, which is essentially, it was meant to maximize the revenue for the client, and also create something which, like one of the things is like when a person is kind of growing up, one of the important epochs is the time they spend doing their graduation. And we thought this should be a kind of a building wherein people should kind of take memories of this building back home, and they should carry that like with them for the rest of their lives. So one of the things is like when I was maybe when I was growing up, the ground floor of the building where I used to stay, my mom had converted into a kind of a hostel. And so a lot of people stayed there, did their engineering, etc. when I was growing up, when I was in school. And then I had this thing that even after 10 years, 15 years, 20 years after they graduated, they still used to visit our homes. They still had memories for those rooms, and they had memories associated with those rooms. And this is something which I always felt like maybe we like sometimes they, even now, they like 2 years back, someone had come with their kid or something. They showed that this is where they stayed doing their engineering. So that is something which we wanted to kind of create for these people, like create this kind of a special space for the students who live here. So these are the kind of spaces which we then created, like which would otherwise have been very dingy kind of small spaces. We kind of opened them up with a kind of a small staircase and the common areas. And yeah, I mean, this we had this almost monolithic form which we gave to this building, because what we realized is that this neighborhood consisted of these small hostels and messes, dining halls, etc., etc. And then it actually was a kind of a visual clutter out there, and like people had added things on the terrace, they had added metal roofs, etc., created more rooms. So we wanted something which could kind of then create this kind of a pause there, in this neighborhood, and at the same time it could be something which is quite distinct, so that people could use that corner as a kind of a like a pause point where people could start identifying their own buildings with respect to this building. So that's something which we try to do here. And a third project in Belgaum, which I would like to go into, is this housing which we are doing in called the Formist Group, which is over here. So if I've taken the KLE Centenary Museum over here, which was in this one campus, then the stacked housing, which is a kind of a private, kind of a small 120 meter square plot, but next to one of the engineering colleges. Then behind this main kind of a campus of a medical university, again by the KLE, there is this housing which we are doing. So which is again a private speculative development, but which is maybe a kind of a suburbanized result of like what maybe these people started 100 years back. The forces which they put in play by kind of starting this institute. This of course came much later after these all people had gone. But then the medical college in turn created this, how could you say, need for kind of housing in that area. And when we look at repetitive housing, of course, we are looking at mass housing, and like which is developer driven and speculative housing. So generally repetitive housing tends to be this very boring, and it tends to be a kind of a one size fits all kind of a situation, like wherein you just create cookie cutter housing, and that has been a kind of a bane of suburbanization for the longest time. And that's something which we are always trying to counter, either through maybe then arbitrariness, which is then introduced not as a part of the process, but rather a kind of a top-down arbitrariness which is put in by the designer. So we looked at, of course, a kind of a Fordist to post-Fordist change in the way customization is now happening, as against when say mass industrialization or like mass production was taking place at the beginning of the 19th century. So whereas nowadays you can kind of customize your cars, to a certain extent within a kind of a template. So we are looking at here like just like at the right point when you see the mini, right? Like you see this way, certain companies are like actually giving you the way to customize. So we thought, how could we kind of then get it into housing? And we the idea was that like no two houses need to be the same, because no two kind of family units may be the same, or maybe there may be singles who may be wanting it. There may be people with extended families, etc. And all of these people would have different kind of requirements and different stimuli. Maybe lifestyles would be different. Someone would be partying a lot. Someone would be more religious. So we came up with a system wherein we thought we'll kind of come up with an app which allowed people to design their own homes, and then we would build those homes for them. And that app would allow a certain amount of customization within a kind of a template which was fixed by us. So this also came from personal experience, wherein most of the people who buy, not buy, but rather who get houses designed by us, they have this whole, like thing that like sometimes they even get, 3D softwares installed on their home computers, because they want to kind of tinker around with their building, etc. So we thought, let's get that process to them, like let them design these houses over their dining tables or whatever in their living rooms. So instead of designing being done by the architects, etc., then builder builds it and then you sell it and then the homeowner occupies it. We thought like we'll first do a design of a kind of a combinatorial universe, like we can do a kind of an entire kind of a system of templates and like choices, etc. And then we introduce it to the home buyer, and then they design it, and then we build it according to that, and then they own it, of course. So we kind of tweak the process of how the architect enters into the system. So the architect enters at in the beginning to create this kind of a combinatorial universe, and then later the kind of the owner takes over. So with that, we had this, we have designed this app wherein in each of these floors, you have like each of the floor plans. You have, you can start with the, say, parking. You can go to the ground and first and terrace. And each of these have like 3 parts, like there's one in the front, one in the back, one in the center. And then you could kind of have options for each of these parts, like whether it's A, B, or C. You could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options or something. And these options need to be compatible with each of these parts, you know, in the X direction as well as in the in the Z direction. So that gives you a kind of, those become restrictions, you know, of how which parts can be combined with which parts, like how staircases can match with one another, etc. So these are some of our, like on the right, these are actually the diagrams which you did in order to explain it to the our app developers as to which combination actually goes with which combination cannot, etc., etc., etc. So we came up with this whole universe wherein we had about 65 or 70 kind of units, small kind of modules which were designed, and they could be combined in some maybe 2,000 or 2,500 ways to create very different buildings. Again, so we have this like 3 parts for the building, and we have floors starting from the parking floor, etc. And then we have a structural grid which stays, you know, like universal, irrespective of which combinations which you take. And so what you get is this kind of a combinatorial universe wherein people can start, you know, like coming up with their own, like sometimes they'll have gardens at the back, sometimes they'll move the staircase somewhere else. And they kind of start playing around and they start taking ownership of that house, because otherwise people generally feel kind of, in such kind of projects, they feel that alienated from the design process. So we thought we'll make them the designers rather than, and get them to the front. And they only interact with us in order to, for sometimes if they get stuck or something like that. To a large extent, that app also lets them kind of see what area they're building up. And even something as practical as, or maybe impractical as Vastu, for example, it lets them calculate like how much of the building is according to Vastu and how much is not. So these are like some perks which are added. So some things which we had from our own experience about how buildings, how people design their own houses in this part of the country. And yeah, I mean, what that also creates is this kind of a, I wouldn't say arbitrariness, but it's more of a it's more of a some kind of a iterative landscape, which is not exactly repetitive, but then that iterative landscape is a result of people making their choices rather than some architect deciding that there needs to be a balcony here or something like that. And these are some of the houses which are being done now. Like it's just in the colony has started. About 7 or 8 houses are being built. These are some of the images of the houses which are being built. And we come to the third city, which these are quicker kind of projects, and I'll go faster now. And so Hubli is the third city, of course, and it was this I found in like when I was making this kind of a small research which I was doing for this presentation, that Hubli always was a kind of it had a kind of a British factory way back in 1673, which Shivaji Maharaj had actually kind of raided, you know, and so it has this big. So this is called Bradshaw's Handbook to the Bombay Presidency, which is a kind of a very interesting book I found, which describes all these areas and where what they are and what is their importance at that time in the British Raj. And so this was always a kind of an important kind of a industrial kind of hub because of the way it was located maybe. And it actually kind of was at this place wherein, you know, like you could go down to the state of Mysore or something, or go down south, and it had all these agricultural areas around. So in this book also, I just include this because this is not at all related to our presentation, but I found this very interesting kind of advertisements from that time, which kind of give you an insight into how people used to actually live at that time. And yeah, so one of the most important parts of like the urbanization process of Hubli, though it was, again, it had a kind of a history right from the 11th century, is the establishment of the railway line. And that railway line, it had its what they call the locomotive shed or something in this area. And so what you have is a kind of a industrial hub which has been created because the railways decided to locate the junction here, and that's where all their engines and all were being serviced. So kind of a huge a mechanical and a kind of electrical industry developed around that kind of a hub. And one of the projects which you did in Hubli was called the Gangubai Hangal Gurukul, which is a Gurukul. It's a Hindustani classical music Gurukul, and in honor of Gangubai Hangal. And so it's very interesting, like as when we were doing this, we kind of looked at why Hindustani classical music came to be of such importance in this area. And what we found is like that because of the road which passed from Kolhapur, say from the north, from the provinces in the middle where Gwalior, Baroda, which used to be like these traditional places, like this princely states where you had a lot of, how could you say, like where Hindustani classical music was encouraged, like all these Gwalior Gharanas, etc., Jaipur, Atroli Gharana. So these people who are there, they used to travel to the state of Mysore, wherein again the Maharaja used to be very much interested in all kinds of arts, including Hindustani classical music. And the people, the artists who used to travel, they generally used to stop over in this area, because it used to be one of their pit stops. And that's where the people from around this area would organize concerts and would kind of interact with these people. And that's how a kind of a love for this Hindustani classical music actually developed in what was essentially like the area of Carnatic music. And so one of the things which also helped is this, the presence of princely states like say Kolhapur or Sangli, Miraj, and such Ramdurg, etc., wherein people would actually, then kings would start inviting these Hindustani classical musicians to become a part of their courts. So that kind of triggered an entire kind of a, maybe a kind of a renaissance in these areas and a kind of a growth of Hindustani classical music. And when we traced, like say Gangubai Hangal, and where like she's of course she was not educated, but she was rather like she was trained under Savai Gandharva, and Savai Gandharva was trained under Abdul Karim Khan. So you have this say 150, 200-year-old history of Hindustani classical music being passed here. And that's why somewhere along the line, we start doing a kind of a, maybe a school of music or something there. So even something as isolated, and this Gangubai Hangal Gurukul is of course a little away from the city, but its presence is directly due to certain forces which were at play maybe 200 years back. And of course, in the Gurukul, we looked at, we had a 5-acre site. So we are limited, of course, by this kind of a nearly kind of a tabula rasa site. And then we had the Gurukul over here and the public facilities over here. And then we had kind of a small nala going, which we converted into a kind of a stream, etc. I'm going very quickly through it now. And we looked at, in this particular project, we looked at how we could divide space linearly. So one is like Ramkulas, of course, in Pakla Village. He kind of orders space in like linear lines, wherein you go from one side to another along the program, but then you can cut across all the programs. So the other way we looked at it is in South Indian villages and towns, and including in even Belgaum and Hubli and all, wherein you generally, like, this is Kalidai Kurchi. This is a kind of a NASA study which was done by one of the colleges, wherein Kalidai Kurchi is a small town in Tamil Nadu, wherein these houses open on one side to the street and one side to the river with a ghat. And they have all kinds of variation happening inside, but then they have this strict linear delineation of space happening from one side to another. So we thought of using that as a kind of a technique, and even technique of, for example, Pakla Village. And we looked at how a Gurukul is separate from a college, because that's what educational institutes the way we kind of understand them are they are spatially separate. They have distinct identities, like of where the staff housing is, where the students housing is, where the classrooms occur, where is the library, etc., etc. And then gurukuls were some things wherein, like for example, Gangubai Handel used to actually stay with the family of Savai Gandharva for days together. They used to work in their like Bhimsen Joshi used to work in their kitchens. They used to carry water from the river every day for the family. So these were the things which actually kind of made there was a kind of a social contract between the student and the teacher, which was very different from where the way students and teachers are kind of organized now. So we thought of making a kind of a gurukul which could be read in two ways. Like if you saw it from, like, say, east to west, you had like the faculty housing, and then you had the academic facilities, you had the students hostels, you had the students gardens, students areas, etc. And then if you saw it from, say, north to south, then each of these became one gurukul. So each of those gurus would have their own kind of a guru house. They would have academic areas. They would have their own students who were their students staying there. So this is, we thought it'll be a kind of a weave, wherein it's a weaving of two different disparate ways of looking at education. And so we had this, wherein we had the academic, we had this modern kind of an institutional kind of a spatiality over here: gurus' houses, academic faculty community spaces, academic blah blah, and students community spaces. And then we had this gurukuls from north to south. And as an emphasis of these gurukuls, we of course had these walls which came from north to south, and which also cast shadows as the sun moves from east to west. These are some of the initial studies which we had done. This was done about 10, 12, 13 years back. Studies of like roofs, etc. So we introduced these Mangalore tile roofs because that was one of the kind of requirements which suddenly came up from one of the gurus or one of the interlocutors between us and the government. And these buildings are not too well finished. Maybe one is because of a lot of involvement of a lot of people also. And what we did here then is these kind of like what you see here, for example, is the guru house. And then we had these lawns going up to the terraces so that the terraces became accessible spaces. And at the same time, it destabilized the notion of the sloping roof as something which sits on a wall. Now the sloping roof became a part of the landscape, and it became a continuation of the grass plains, so to speak. And then you had these kind of spaces which are also, because of these inclines, we also created spaces wherein you could have, say, chabutaras wherein people would sit and give impromptu performances, and you could have people sitting on these lawns as natural amphitheaters. And yeah, what you see here in the front is the gurus, the faculty community spaces. So they're quite distanced out from the student spaces, and you have to pass through the guru's house in order to access them, or you have to go all the way across to do that. So that created this sense of privacy, but at the same time, there was this sense of connection when you saw from east to west, you could see these distinct spaces, but north to south, you could see these gurukuls as acting as one, each one as a kind of a cohesive unit. So these are, of course, the landscape. The one in the middle becomes a kind of a street from where you can approach the guru's house from the back and the student's house from the front. Yeah, these are some of the students' housing which happens. Oh, sorry. So another project we would like to show is one which we did for this gentleman over here, like Mr. Gururaj Deshpande, who did his early education in these areas, but then he went to the US and he struck it big there, wherein he also he founded many companies, and then he also is on the board of MIT in the US. He is also on several boards across the world for innovation, for technology, etc. And then he wanted to contribute something to this city over here, Hubli, that was his hometown, but also in a way in which it could change the landscape of Hubli. So he kind of talked with the KLE Technological University, wherein he had some kind of connections, because he is also the brother-in-law of Sudhamurthy, and Sudhamurthy was educated here in Hubli in this college. So they got a kind of a part of the campus, and they wanted to kind of build a building wherein what the campus would get would be a kind of an auditorium, and they could use their kind of facilities like offices and classrooms, etc., for themselves. So there was this. One of the things why this building came to be in the campus itself is because of Indian laws also, because he being an American citizen, he could not he was not in a position to kind of form an NGO. It was taking a huge time for him to form an NGO, which could then purchase land in Karnataka, which they have since done, in India rather. So they came up with this arrangement, and then we thought we will kind of this arrangement wherein the auditorium becomes a kind of a shared space, which they kind of fund, but then the college can use. In turn, the college kind of gives them this area, and we thought we can explore this relationship between the shared and what could be exclusively theirs, and we could actually make that into we could actually kind of make that as a strategy to deal with the building. So what we did is we took the auditorium part, we kept it to one side, and we took their facilities which they would use to the other side, and they kind of dovetailed into one another, and they also kind of formed this kind of an interlock. And of course, the auditorium, because of its raking, it also gets this kind of a underside to it. And what we thought is, instead of then delineating it from the campus and making it separate from the campus, at the same time creating a space for them, which is kind of a semi-outdoor space, which is within the campus, but yet belongs to them, we thought of kind of then distancing these buildings apart, like just kind of pull them apart and create the space underneath, so that at the back you get a kind of a private plaza, you get a kind of an underneath space, and then here connects to the mother campus, so to speak. And so we have this building over here, wherein it kind of, the landscape flows from under the building, and then it emerges on the other side, and then you have this auditorium on the top. And we have created this space. I mean, if you go to the website, they have many videos of this space being used, and this space actually is used more than the core spaces which are inside the building. So that was also one of the ways in which we thought of the interstice, because what happens is this becomes the space in the middle, which is the outdoor space, becomes multiply coded, whereas this is very monofunctional, the auditorium, etc. Yeah, and then this is the other building with its offices, with its library and small other facilities, a cafe, etc. This is the first floor. We create a plaza which then interconnects to the bottom. So this was about 12 or 13 years back. And in the same campus, we are doing another project. So this is at the back. This is a private kind of a private plaza for this institute. So generally that act of going through this underneath the auditorium itself becomes a kind of a threshold. So another thing in the same campus, so this campus itself is very interesting, wherein it has these buildings, then it has many incubator cells, and now it is getting a kind of a sports center, which is designed by us, which is our last project, which we'll show here. And yeah, I mean, here, wherein this is the entrance to the campus, and then this again is a kind of a, like, this is a kind of a design which comes through a kind of a contested kind of a way of looking at what this building should be. So the vice chancellor wanted a building which is kind of seen from the road, and it has its presence on the road. And whereas the chancellor and the chairman of the of KLE Society, he didn't want this garden to go off. There used to be a kind of a big garden over here, and from here he didn't want a building to be seen over here, because he felt like this is one of the vantage points from where the university is seen, and whereas everything else has got built in this university, this place was one of those places wherein you could see some amount of green. So for that, what we did is we had this brief to create this kind of a sports center which could also become a convocation hall. And we decided to kind of then tuck in this building underneath the existing lawns, and we let the lawns grow over the building. And the building then, we also, one of the things which we had going in our favor is levels, wherein this is one of the main roads in the city. And then from here, you actually climb up to about 4 meters or 5 meters. So we use that difference to create a building which could be seen from the road, but which nearly disappeared under the landscape over here. And so this is the building which we're creating there, and it's in construction right now. And so what happens is, from the road, you see this kind of a building which is almost, like it's at an angle to the road, and so it creates this kind of a facade which travels with you as you go in your car. And then at one end, it just lifts up from the how could I say, from this kind of a point, it just lifts up so that it doesn't actually sit on the ground. It has this kind of a illusion that it actually kind of floats on that. And then when you see it from the campus side, then it almost disappears into the ground, wherein we cut a kind of a slice of it in order to let people enter in through a kind of entrance lobby. But then we also have these areas wherein the building kind of climbs up. And yeah, I mean, this is one of our interns who is standing under the cantilever which is being built. And so it's this space over here, which is underneath. And then what happens is, like, the building has this lightness which comes across with this introduction of this kind of a cut, and wherein inside you have a kind of a gym or something like that. And this is the building being constructed. So these are recent photographs of the site, wherein you have the steel trusses which are nearly on the ground here. If you see over here, there's a very nondescript type of building at the back, which is something which we are living with. But then, and then the building, the roofs nearly touch the ground. But then if you see in the center, you have got about 10 meters of space over here because of the way we have used the section. So that is it. I mean, what we were kind of trying to showcase through these kind of 9 projects in 3 cities was somewhere the kind of linkages of our own projects to a kind of a distant past, wherein how these cities have grown, but also the kind of the diversity in how we are dealing with our projects and the kind of briefs which are thrown at us also. So that was a kind of a very brief kind of an idea of like where like at least these 3 cities, the way they're growing, the complexity which we deal with, like, and the continuity, which is like, there are these continuities which exist between what we are doing right now and what happened like 100, 150, 200 years back, and how that is even now it is kind of trying to shape the city as we go on in the future. And maybe to a certain extent, like something which we do maybe in these times may in turn influence these cities' growth in some other ways, like maybe maybe a sports center over here with these kind of facilities may create a kind of a sporting culture maybe for the university, which goes on and flowers into something else. So that's the kind of those are the kind of forces which we also try to kind of harness through our own architecture. Thanks a lot. Thanks for being so patient.
Thank you, Praveen. It was fantastic to see a lot of new work coming from the office. As always, exciting to see the responses that come from the studio to the challenges thrown. Before I comment or let audience ask you questions, like, I want to just throw in a couple of anecdotes and then point out some of the things that really caught my attention in the presentation. And these anecdotes also come from starting from my student days, wandering around the office, almost as an informal student. So the first anecdote is, like, I remember when I think it was Neelkant Chaya who had come to the studio, and there was a sort of a presentation by architects from Kolhapur, your presentation, I think Chaya also presented. It was almost like a review of young practices, and Chaya was responding in his own flair in an interesting manner. And one of the things that struck me um, back in those days was like how, although let's say your background or your training has been in the computational, so to speak, thinking, you quickly realize that in order to kind of, to do to have a practice, so to speak, in a city like Belgaum or a country like India, in that economy at that moment, what are the shifts that one needs to kind of maneuver and make in order to kind of use similar thinking processes, but like to a completely different end. And that sort of pragmatism in responding to, let's say, the context, the condition, or the landscape that you're kind of referring to has kind of, I think, has been sort of a hallmark, so to speak, of your practice in some sense. I think it's probably high time that somebody put it together, kind of a quick, let's say, a monograph of that practice, which has been around for quite some time. And the second anecdote, which basically, and I sent a rough sketch to you like a few years back, like if one were to kind of draw a map of the end from entrance to Belgaum, where you hit the KLE campus, the medical campus towards Goa. In fact, that actually comes in the map that you've also drawn. And many of the projects that actually you could not show, but I remember the International Boys Hostel in JNMC, which had a fantastic sectional idea. Of course, and I think the story of how it did not really actually manifest in that manner, in the way it was imagined, is probably even more interesting also, as much as the sectional idea is. You can probably elaborate on that, because I think it was an interesting shift in program after the design process was done. If you would want, maybe you can elaborate later as a response to this. Yeah, I think these two anecdotes kind of really stuck with me, probably also because for some reason I've been following your work very closely since school days, accidentally or otherwise. So again, before I take questions from the audience, like I'll just maybe quickly summarize, I think, what was the relevance of this presentation for this series, as well as also for this moment of shift of attention, one can say, towards what gets classified as either second cities or tier 2 cities or tier 3 cities. And which is basically to see how are architects actually responding to these emerging, urbanization conditions and economic shifts that this kind of cities are actually undergoing. And I think, as I had also pointed out in the review of that hostel for Domus, and I think one of the interesting facts, and which came across in all the projects that you showed, is how can architects really engage in kind of thinking and respond to the emerging urbanization landscape, so to speak. The term that you use for that landscape was quite nice, which is urban hinterlands, or let's say or those urban zones which kind of seem kind of get overlooked. We're all struggling to find a term for that zone, and I think it's a nice term that you use, urban hinterlands. I'm sure my colleagues would have something or the other to kind of add to that. And the second thing is basically, I was just trying to figure out what are the ways in which some of these architectural responses are trying to do, to the challenges that get thrown at a practice, so to speak. And I remember here again the ANDC brief that you had sketched out in 2006 or something like that, or 5 or 6, which is basically to reimagine the ubiquitous, or even not ubiquitous also, but like also the unproductive, so to speak, parking space. So how does one rethink and reprogram the parking space? And the first project that you showed from Kolhapur actually reminded me of that, and it's great to see that it's those after many years at least, that has actually become an urban reality, so to speak. And how does one rethink of those programs that otherwise are seen as kind of, like in what happens in Bombay is that 10 floors of parking is the given. Like you can't do anything with that kind of situation. And so basically this question of reprogramming expectations and demands that get thrown or that actually pop up also because of the conditions of urbanization, and how can architects really intervene at the program level first, and then kind of think introduce new formal moves to make those possible. It does not remain as a wish list, but what are the ways in which you can actually translate it into form, space, so on and so forth. And I think that was the first coordinate which I found was very interesting. And the second aspect, which again, remembering back the early days of the articulation of facade that you did for some of your early works for KLE. I remember the windows at the bottom, windows in between, and windows on top, each performing a different function. But at the same time, doing something like that for the housing project that you just showed, right? So not necessarily bring architect as a person who only designs and then delivers, but how can one intervene in the processes per se, and kind of not necessarily look at design as the design of building, but also the design of processes and the design of so I think these two aspects for me kind of stood out in the presentation, and as a kind of maybe maybe I'm kind of getting ahead of, let's say, the framework of the presentation, but what I found very interesting is that how does one nuance the idea of future when it comes to urban imaginations? Usually we kind of get thrown at either in this kind of Tesla, Bezos kind of mode, where AI, machine learning, and those kind of things would be space travel, would be the sort of image of the future, so to speak. On the other hand, when we look at this, so to speak, urban hinterlands, as you're saying, there's a very grounded imagination of the future that gets really unfolded, which is basically based in the deep historical processes, way institutions get formed, or way, let's say, the land gets shaped, the immediate demands that one kind of sees in the horizon of 20-30 years, rather than the sort of a future which is in the void. I think these 3 or 4 things for me were really important, and I think that the question that I was constantly asking was like, how are architects really responding? And I think your presentation sort of brings in that both possibilities, as well as a kind of a relevant way to think about how architects can respond to urban and urbanization processes. So yeah, so do you have any responses or thoughts to some of those? Yeah.
You touched on many things, so I don't know how much should I respond to. But then the last thing which you said about this idea of like the future as something which is completely devoid of the past, like it's maybe something which leaves the past behind or something, is of course it's a kind of a Western preoccupation also, that things will be so different that like like much of the past can be erased or something. But then that's exactly what like when I was preparing for this presentation also, what I realized, like when I started like looking at like why did Gangubai Hangal Gurukul come where it came, like why did it come in Hubli, or why did Gangubai Hangal herself become a kind of such a big dot? Of course she had it within herself. I mean, that's not that like every person who trained with Savai Gandharva goes on to reach that. But then what makes it, what are these forces which make it possible for certain kind of things to come? And then you realize how much of your present and your future depends on like these processes. And then like if you need to kind of even kind of look at the future, then you need to tweak the processes right now. So that could also be the way we're looking at. So it reminds me of like even Ridley Scott when about the first Blade Runner, when he kind of sketched out what the future will be, he made a very messy kind of a future, like he said, like the future should be something which you see around the corner. If you see something really distant with like flying cars, of course there are flying cars in Blade Runner also, but then if you see these kind of gleaming kind of skyscrapers or something, like there's no kind of trace of the past, then people cannot relate to it. But the future is always something which is messy, which is always like maybe many dialects, many styles of architecture which have collapsed, maybe crumbling streets, crumbling kind of infrastructures. That also is the future, along with the flying cars. So that I think that's exactly how India is also going to urbanize, and like most of our cities are going to experience that. Like you will not see a kind of a Hubli or a Kapurthala or like maybe any other place, like just kind of transforming itself into these kind of Singapores or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this was my thoughts. And just there are a couple of questions in the chat, and maybe if any of my colleagues want to ask, I'll ask Dipti to let them in. But till that happens, I'll just read out some of the questions that are here. And
Sure.
So Ronak Soni says, "Hello, Praveen. I would like to better understand the relation between the statical urban graphs and the diagram of the forms which were presented. How does this act of drawing hold these individual ventures at the urban scale?"
Sorry, is the statistical?
Statistical
Maybe.
Statistical graphs, yeah.
Okay. So, and the urban and the forms.
Yeah. So I think how the relationship between the graphs that you showed, I think particularly in the first project.
I think first project, yeah. So we were trying to like, when generally we look at context, right? Like we look at context as something which is like, generally when we say context, then we look at the immediate roads, or we look at, maybe geographical or kind of physical features. So we first of all, one is we wanted to visualize certain data. We wanted to look at how certain forces are at play there. Like why are restaurants kind of coagulating towards one area, or why are kind of shopping going towards that. So that was our own way of analyzing the city also, and we're trying to kind of come up with, like any patterns which may emerge, which may not be visible to a kind of through an Excel sheet, or just through coding a kind of a map or something. So that was one of the ways in which we are looking at. So that also kind of some of those things which we finally did in our proposals comes from that kind of informed analysis, so to speak. One thing we realize is like there are not many offices like who will just take about 30,000 or 40,000 or say 3, 4, 5,000 square meters of space and establish a kind of a service economy based industry, or like a kind of a banking thing. Maximum a bank may take a back office of about 1,000 square meters or something. So that's where we kind of thought is, how then can we get these commercial kind of spaces up the building or something. So these kind of the graphs and all helped us kind of to a certain extent make sense of the kind of the space which we are dealing with, especially because it was a city which we had not dealt with before that.
And I think the fact that how does one arrive at a program, that I think you mentioned it in your presentation, right? So how does one arrive at a program? I think probably a study like that also helps in arriving at that. The second question is from Jatan Gala. He's saying, through the talk, starting from a large understanding of cities, you entered into the form of the design of a plot responding to the city. I was wondering and interested in the inverse relation. How is the projects redesigning the city, and thus what is the new idea of a city being produced? Hence, what is the larger urban landscape that is being produced with 9 projects across 3 cities? I think it's probably saying how do these interventions sort of contribute?
Yeah, maybe yeah, but that's very interesting. That's always something which we are always wanting to know. Like we are some of these projects are of course built, and some are yet to be built. So for some, we kind of speculate that this is how a city will change or something. And for the ones which are built, like we are always kind of looking at what is it making to the city around us. Because, for example, things like for that housing in Belgaum, like that is slowly changing the kind of the nature of that area itself. Wherein when we started with that project, so we like the area was not regarded as a kind of a housing area at all, like for some reasons, like it was not considered. It was an industrial wasteland, a particular site for that matter. So there are other studies which are maybe required for that, like maybe like and then again empirical maybe evidence which can then support our kind of analysis of that. But that's very interesting. That's something which as an office we'll attempt in the future, of course.
Actually, I mean, if I can, like, chime into this, like, one of the things that happens is that we often neglect that as much as the context informs the building, it is ultimately also the building that produces the new context.
Yeah.
Kind of, there's a strange relationship that gets built with this, and I think it's not an easy measure also how one, like, reproduce one another. Anyway, so I'll go to the third question. Ashwin is asking this question. Ashwin Gupta is asking, hi Praveen, what is the difference between the study of the market, finances, demand, supply, laws, etc., and the study of the processes of urbanization?
What is the Ashwin's questions? Okay. What is the difference between?
Difference between the study of the market, which is basically finances, demand, supply, laws, etc., and the study of processes of urbanization.
I think that they're not. Urbanization is a kind of a product of a larger kind of forces of markets, but also urbanization also comes from within, and urbanization is something which maybe stays on because you carry the kind of could you call it scars, or could you call it kind of the signs of all the kind of market forces which have been in the past also. So if a certain, because urbanization or even urban form for that matter, or even urban areas, they have certain kind of ossified kind of spaces which are maybe kind of the detritus of the past market forces. So whereas market forces become a kind of a part of our study, and we are ultimately, like, we cannot think of urbanization or like any kind of a study of urbanism as something which is in a kind of a vacuum, which is kind of divorced from any market forces or any other kind of forces. But at the same time, those are not the only ones which are informing urbanization.
Yeah, Ashwin probably knows this better also, because of the studies that they've done at the school. I was also thinking that, the last presentation that you gave at C, which was titled, I think, Cities Within Me, where I think the opening argument was basically between how the processes of subdivision of land has a huge impact on the form that is possible in those cities. I think that's which
right.
also
I looked at Pune and Bangalore is what I looked at. Yeah.
Right. I think it's very, those are also reflective of, let's say, the kind of economies that the cities are able to participate, who are the actors who are able to, shape that sort of land urbanization processes, so to speak, and the capacity to kind of deal with land in that sense. So I think these are 3 questions from the audience so far we have received. I'm wondering if anybody from the faculty or anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question in person. Just wait for a couple of minutes. So I think until we get that, I've probably missed one very important point, which is basically connected to what Ashwin is trying to say, which is, I mean, one of the impetus for to put together this series was also because as a school, we are interested in looking at what's happening in, so to speak, the second cities, right? And our entry point to understanding these urbanization processes have been very close to the way you've titled the presentation, which is what is driving these urbanization processes today, whether it is knowledge economy, whether it is industries, whether it is, let's say, I mean, we've identified more or less across 6-7 cities, close to 10 repetitive sort of drivers of these urbanization, and I think in that sense, it is like you pointed out, it's a very important. I mean, it's not an easy reading of cities, right? Like whether it is economy or whether it is simply, let's say modernization or infrastructure or things like that. But there are many layered, so to speak, forces that are at play along with economy, which kind of shape and really produce a specificity to the urban form, right? So,
yeah, it cannot, like, at the most we kind of looked at three cities, like in our own presentation or something, but then it's a very complex matter. Like, for example, the way Bellary developed in the early part of maybe 2000s or something, when there was a kind of a building boom in China, and that created a kind of a demand for iron ore, which which essentially iron ore which was not being consumed at all, or it was uneconomical to kind of get this iron ore to the coast and then make it go to China or something. Suddenly it became much more viable for that, and then because of that there was an entire boom which the region witnessed, including environmental degradation, and including a kind of a whole economy which came up around that. So that is not something that a study of these cities is not going to give you that any insight into that. And then neither was Bellary kind of a product of what was happening in the neighborhood, but it was a product of what was happening somewhere else. Like maybe in another part of the continent. So these are, and like then we are made up of these kind of 400-500 maybe such agglomerations. Each one of these are kind of catering to very different forces. Like that it's very difficult to kind of have a kind of a meta narrative wherein we can say that this is what is happening with the smaller cities in India.
Yes, absolutely. Prasad wants to make a point. So Dipti, do you want to let Prasad in?
Thanks, Praveen. Very nice to kind of see a fresh volume of work. Actually, it's kind of always a pleasure. Can you hear me, Shank? Yeah. Okay. No, I was continuing in the line of which that earlier question was around the idea of the diagram of urbanization and the response, the architectural response. So, and I feel that like actually from 2001 onwards, there has been this narrative of the growth of second cities, and the way it's been conceptualized is through this optic, which is that of a map that you'll find in the map of India, a lot of dots which speak about the growth of cities. And of course, there is a census idea of the cities and the way intensities happen in cities and stuff like that. I feel that that representation of urbanization, which is basically increase in dots, that is kind of growing, becomes a very like a shorthand idea of thinking of urbanization, because there is a lot of shift, like even in Sriyank's the school studies of 6 cities in the south of India, Trichy and Coimbatore and Mysore, Bangalore. You see the shift in economy and substantial shift in the way physicality is kind of is like a clear idea of property, a clear idea of tenureship, or a clear idea of privacy, so to say, which consolidated in the 80s and the 90s. Like in your own hostels, suddenly the demand for hostels increase because the nature of economy changes. The demand. What I'm trying to say is that that the urbanization produces many contexts which are not, which are I guess beyond a beyond the which happen beyond the clear brief and a clear strategy, clear brief of a client actually. For example, one of the hypotheses that we are working with right now is formally educated architects provide services to only 10% of population in the country, because their education is unable to enter the kind of inhabitation production in which the other 90% lives. For example, how like 35% of Indian urban India lives in slums, and architects do not know how to enter that process of, because there is no clear property, no clear boundary, no tendering system, no working drawing possible, no, the whole range of things that we do as architects cannot be mobilized. Rural India, which is 70% of the population, kind of works at a different register altogether, where you do not find formally educated architects entering. So the thing is that urbanization narrative, which emerges from those dot kind of thing, is a fairly limited narrative. Whereas you've been working with second cities, Kolhapur and Belgaum, and the whole range of cities, and in your do you come across these kind of moments where you are faced with this with the characteristic of this urbanization, which is that of not so clear. For example, the boundary is not clear. For example, the rules are not so clear. For example, the client is not so clear, or the clientele is not so clear, the users are not so clear. So it's like urbanization has been about so many non-clarities actually. Like even in the first project that you showed, which is kind of the question of parking, so like those questions are not so clear actually in many of the cities. So do you encounter this difficulty with the urban, while entering and dealing with the urban? Because and what tools do we have as architects to kind of engage with it? We like a lot of people are talking of community participation today, a lot of architects, but we don't have tools to kind of engage. We don't know, and it kind of, we make a mess quite often than ever. Enough evidences of that. So when architects take up urbanization question, what are the methods to kind of go about shaping the physicality of the urban? Because it doesn't seem to be so clear as a clear client, clear program, clear project, clear boundary, clear rules, etc. It's a different game. So that's what I was thinking, that it's in line with the earlier question, that how does the complexity of urbanization kind of shape our own kind of processes? It's like a
see, one of the things is this again, this the binary between, like, say, rural and urban is something which as you go down further, it kind of dissolves, like. So I also do some bit of farming, and I'm also connected to my farmlands, and that's in a village which is about 25 kilometers from here. And some very interesting, like, you go there and you learn some very interesting things. Like, for example, the panchayat, there's a small panchayat hall there, and that has become the most important place in the evenings, not because of any panchayat activities, but it gives you free Wi-Fi. So everyone goes with their smartphones and they're all hanging around there, like getting free Wi-Fi and watching maybe TikTok videos, whatever, to even maybe, emailing or whatever. Like we should not kind of think that they may be doing only that. But then the whole idea that like something like Wi-Fi, or free Wi-Fi by the government becomes a kind of a rallying point, or it becomes a kind of it creates like, because we would assume that panchayats are these places where people come and interact, but maybe they are not. They're just sitting in their corners and doing their own things with their smartphones. So, and what I would actually think is like, if the thing of boundaries is very interesting, because when I deal, not as an architect, but even as a kind of a landowner or something, I deal with questions of boundaries. These were very fluid once upon a time, but even now, nowadays, like even these houses in the villages, for that matter, everything, the government also in its process of digitization has made it very hard for this fluidity to happen. So once upon a time, you had like very fluid kind of concepts of like which courtyard belongs to whom and who is using it, etc. In these village houses. But then, because of the government's process of digitization and making everything clear and like in a black and white manner, it has also ossified these boundaries and also made these. So these changes are happening there. Like these. That's very and like you don't see that. Like here in Belgaum, for example, like we don't see that kind of such a distinction between the village and the city, as we would maybe say from somewhere in Pune or something. So first of all, the landscape also, like we don't exactly know where a city kind of stops and the nearest village begins, and then it then kind of further dissolves and then another village starts, etc. And there are these very aspirational ways at which even how people in the rural areas look at urban life, and they want those parts of it in their own houses or in their own lifestyles also. So maybe urbanity is not exactly only about densities of the cities.
True. Do you want to respond to the second part of Prasad's question, which was about how does one, like if you have encountered in terms of your design process, any project which kind of works with such blurred.
One of the things about the blurred, yeah, I mean, now that I think of it, like when I kind of the idea, the process of doing architecture itself is kind of delineating these boundaries sometimes. So even the maybe that's what some meant when I said about the digitization process or something like that, is when we start about going about even say sanctioning a project. One of the first aspects of sanctioning a project is to kind of first establish your boundaries and establish what your kind of the nature of the site is, and whether it meets with your government records or not. So these contested kind of like we have dealt with kind of sites wherein there has been a lot of contested areas about whether this is government land, whether this is kharab land, whether it was used for some industry, and then now that it is being privatized, or now some kind of a development is coming over it. So what I would suggest is like the process of doing architecture itself in a certain manner, it kind of doesn't dilute, but makes these kind of distinctions very rigid. Because I've seen it in the past, wherein clients have come to us, or we have wanted to kind of develop parcels of land. But the first aspect of developing a parcel of land is to take away all these kind of blurs and first establish your site, because after you establish your site, then your FAR and everything starts coming on it. So that, when I think about it, so the act of going to an architect itself to a certain extent, dissolves any blurring which there is, but then if we would have dealt with maybe community projects wherein there are multiple stakeholders, then it becomes more interesting. but to a large extent, everyone nowadays, like even in the rural areas or something, they're more about kind of the idea of property has become very rigid, as to what you own and what you don't own. So that is slowly there. It's no longer an urban thing. I think it's also a governmental thing, because the way when I was doing these researches also, like, and through my own experience of even my farming or my own lands or something, what comes across is like there used to be this kind of a very how could you say, a very fuzzy way of understanding what is yours and what is not, and what is ownership and what is not. I like some of these things, when I think in hindsight, like when my father used to take me out to the farms when I was a child, like he would kind of say that you are not the owner of the lands. Okay, it's just that people let you think that you are the owner. Okay, so so like the people who are working for you, they let you think that you are the owner, and that's why you are the owner. Yeah. Okay, so don't like because he had grown up in these times wherein the Tenancy Act had come for example, a lot of the lands were in flux, and there were so many interesting things which were happening at that time. Like there was so much of reorganization of like ancient ways of how land was viewed, and then how then land kind of came about to be parceled later. And I've seen it happening in my own village for that matter. I've seen families which would have been still in a kind of a maybe in a kind of a how could say, in a kind of a labor kind of an economy. Okay, they just by kind of gaining access to land and gaining access to land rights over 2-3 generations, they moved to a completely different level of education, also of even their own personal economy also. So and so one of the things which has happened is, of course, there has been a dilution of this whole thing about what is yours and what is mine. Okay, that has become more and more kind of distinct over the years, and it is getting more and more there with every time kind of lands are getting divided, or every time lands are getting passed down the generations. It becomes more and more kind of rigid.
It's interesting the way you kind of connected the digitization process to also the way consolidation of property and ownership, and and how, and what is implicit in this is the exclusions that take place. That there are people who identify themselves with, but then that process also excludes others who would have otherwise existed in that fluidity, and it's interesting the way you make the point that architecture lends itself to further consolidate this process. Actually, it's like a so and that's precisely what we also see as struggling. If there is any agency with architects to kind of keep the smudge or the blur, preserve that blur, keep the blur, which provides for multiple people to kind of exist and reduce the exclusions. And what is the form of, what is the architecture of that? So how does one kind of, so you're dealing with completely non with things which are like impermanent, things which are unclear, things which are soft, and things where so you're dealing with all of those things, and you want with something which being incomplete, and it's not a clear project, so you're dealing with all of those things, and we don't know at the moment. We are struggling at sea to kind of orient a pedagogy around it. How do you kind of think, because we feel that what you said is precisely the problem, because architecture somehow, the way it is kind of practiced at the moment, consolidates these boundaries very clearly, and in that process excludes people substantially, actually. So what is the process? And then there is also the question of environment. the whole, because environment doesn't follow any of these boundaries. So it's kind of, there are so many shifts that kind of, take place. So this is the question which is kind of, we're struggling also at sea.
Yeah, I think like many of these blurs, okay, they to a certain extent, our laws define them. Like whether it's like an easement right, or whether it's a kind of a tenancy, like a rent control or something like that. Like the whole thing that like the whole black and white issue of ownership and non-ownership is actually kind of looked at in law in detail, like wherein a person can have other rights on the land other than ownership. So what ownership also is a kind of a limited right. It's not an absolute right. And the only thing is the act of like whenever an act of architecture happens, like we have dealt with like so I also look at there's some like I'm also looking at real estate kind of projects, right? Like when I'm also kind of somehow related to kind of a real estate company, and I kind of I'm a director there also. But when we look at lands, for example, and when people are like, when lawyers are looking at lands, they are going into all these kinds of soft smudges, as you would kind of say, and they're kind of evening them out. Yeah. And they're kind of like dealing with them. Like they're saying like, okay, this kind of these rights exist. So what do you like? This temple exists, and this temple has these rights. So what do we do about it? So do we talk to the temple authorities and we get it cleared and we get our boundary done? Okay, and we deal with it. Or there's this neighbor who had this kind of road, and then he was always using the road, and he has put a case in 1980. What happened to that? So how can we clear it? So so that's why I said like one of the formal architecture, when it comes and enters into a kind of into the fray, then to a certain extent the blurs become kind of distinct, and boundaries become more ossified and rigid.
That's all.
Right. So I think we are about 20 minutes over time. So it was fantastic and fun. Also, I think quite engaging to see the way the practice has been responding to so many challenges. And thanks for your talk. It's quite engaging. So and then just for our audience, our next talk, I think, let me check the date, is on 4th of March. It will be by Arijit Sen, the artist who's based in Goa, who is speaking about his way of looking at, let's say, urban conditions beyond the metropolis. So see you all next time. And thank you once again, Praveen, for engaging.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Prasad. Thanks, Shreya.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone. Yeah.